Hi, everybody. It's Monday, January 19th, 2025, and our dear friend, Colonel Jacques Baud, is here with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Hello, hello to everybody. Thank you for inviting me again. Happy to be back on your channel. You hear me?
Yeah, we yeah we had some sort of technical issues here, and please comment if you see if you hear or see some sort of issue, and let us know if you can hear us and you can see us just fine. And Colonel, let me start with what's going on with the case of Greenland and what Donald Trump is talking about. The European Union is somehow is they don't know what to do with this new issue on Greenland because it's a technical issue. I don't know. We can call it a technical, a political issue within NATO that is somehow separating countries from each other. And what is your understanding of the current sort of issue, current sort of problem within NATO? Because yesterday we had an interview on MSNBC with his U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He said that between NATO and Greenland, the reporter was asking him, between Greenland and NATO, you have to pick one. He said, no, that's not the issue. What is your understanding of that?
Well, first of all, we have to notice that it's not the first time you have such a problem within NATO because you already had the case of Cyprus, which is an example where you have one country claiming the territory of another NATO country. And in that case, that was Turkey, Greece. And this case has never been solved basically within the framework of NATO. The NATO can live with that, with such a situation. And here we have a similar case. The problem is that we have a situation where we have an Europe that tries to assert itself as a economic, political, and even military power, but at the same time is absolutely incapable of reacting. I would say even it's not just about they're not even capable of doing the right thing. They are not capable of reacting. They don't know what to do in that particular case of Greenland. Now, the issue of Greenland and the US is an old one because the US has, since the mid 19th century, the US have contemplated the idea of buying Greenland. We have to remember that by the mid 19th century, the US had the opportunity to buy a part of, what was called Louisiana, which is in fact much bigger than the current state of Louisiana. They bought that from the French. They bought a part of southern Texas, I think, from Mexico or from Spain. They bought later on the Alaska from Russia. So in the in 19th century, the United States were building up their state, their country, not just by invading it as they did in the so-called Wild West, but also by buying some territories. And since the 19th century, Denmark, who is the sovereign power there, refused consistently to sell it. Now, what is new today is that the US, beyond going to make an aggressive purchase offer, is also making kind of blackmail over Europe at large and Denmark in order to get this territory. And that's new because it's not just a commercial or a trading trading territory. It's about gaining a territory by force. And that we are back in the situation that we had in the 70s between Greece and Turkey, where a strong power decides to take over another country. The Danes have, and that's interesting because the we know since Donald Trump was elected that he would claim territory of Greenland, and that was he claimed that publicly, so that was known, and that came several times in 2025 in the rhetoric of Donald Trump. But the Danes never reacted to that. And they even put in their intelligence assessment of 2025, their intelligence outlook for 2025, they said that the main threat to Denmark, and especially to Greenland, was Russia and China. And today you have Donald Trump taking over this this assessment of the Danish intelligence service and say, well, the Danes claim themselves that their main threats to Greenland are Russia and China, but it's such a huge territory. Denmark has not the power to defend that territory. And since this territory would be very important for the security of the United States, it means that we need to get a hold on this territory because then Denmark would not be able to defend it, and that would create a security situation for the US. And so Trump has, in fact, used the Danish intelligence assessment to justify its own claim for taking over Greenland. The Danish government, instead of taking preventive political measures in order to anticipate this US claim, has done virtually nothing. And now Denmark is caught between Europe that desperately need the US in order to solve the Ukrainian crisis. And we have seen that for Europe, the Ukraine crisis, especially the threat of Russia, is a key element of European foreign policy. So the Europe wants the US, want to keep the US in the conflict. And on the other hand, the US seeks its own strategic interests. Therefore, their national security strategy that claim their, let's say, dominance, I would say, over the whole Western Hemisphere, which means the whole American, North and South American continents. And of course, in that move, because it's about US security, Greenland belongs to that to that enterprise. So Denmark has caught itself between two allies who are not allies, and two allies who are in fact trying to find a way to better to better communicate together without by excluding the problem of Denmark. And we see more and more voice in Europe that say, well, at the end, it would not be a big problem if the US would be in Greenland. So, and you have seen very moderate responses to the threats of Donald Trump, and even better because Donald Trump has even threatened the whole of you. I mean, not the whole of Europe, but some countries in Europe of tariffs. Again, this is also this blackmail with tariffs if they don't comply with what the US wants, and we are in that same situation. So now countries like France, the UK, and so on are threatened with tariffs, and they don't want to poke the eagle, if I want, and therefore they tend to have a very moderate response to the U.S. threat. So we have a crisis within the Western camp, I would say, and the Western Party, especially when it comes to the conflicts with Russia and China. And within the Western Party, we have of course, a problem within the NATO, because obviously the US is part of NATO. And in fact, the US is the keystone of NATO. Remember that NATO was, in fact, an alliance that was designed to provide European countries with the US nuclear umbrella. And that's why the US has always got this primus inter pares role the alliance. That means that even if you have all the members of the alliance who are, in theory, equals, well, some are more equals than other, and especially the US is a little bit more equal in the sense that it is the country around which NATO has been constructed. So, therefore, the Europeans cannot afford to have a collapse of NATO, because that would mean that they lose the nuclear umbrella that they desperately need, especially now when they claim this threat of Russia and things like this. So now they are caught between their narrative and the interest of the United States. And it's also in the EU because, as I said before, the EU now is trying to portray itself not just as an economic power, but also as a political and military power. And that was the whole issue of this policy or initiative, I would say, from Ursula von der Leyen to have this called rearm Europe with huge investment in for the military industrial complex of European countries and things like this, meaning that Europe again is caught itself between what it wants to do and what it is able to do and what he wants to do, because they understand that the US might at some point have separate interests than Europe, and that's a rationale for having a militarized, or let's say the Europe as a military power in itself. But at the same time, they understand that in the meantime, they still need the nuclear power of the US, and they especially need the influence of the US, because even if the Europe claims to be also a political power, it is not. And we have seen that when it comes to foreign policy, Europe is extremely weak, has in fact not achieved any kind of result. Look at all the crises we have witnessed in the last 2 or 3 years: Palestine, Iran, Pakistan, and India, China, and so on. We have a lot of crises, Taiwan, and all that. So all these crises, and of course the one in Ukraine, and in none of these crises, Europe has been able to show that it has a voice in a credible voice to solve the problem. So we have here um, a Europe that is claiming to be a power but is not. The US, who claims to be an ally of the West, but in fact works for its own interests. And remember, I don't remember which French politician used to say that the countries or states do not have friends, they have interests. And that's exactly what we have here with the United States. Remember that the key word of Donald Trump during his whole presidential campaign was "Make America Great Again." That was not "Make the West Great Again." Was not "Make Europe Great Again." It was "Make America Great Again." And obviously, United States is. For good or bad and bad reason, by the way, is a competitor of the Europe. And since Donald Trump is a businessman, there's obviously not much sentiment in his approach to the competition. It's just the Darwinist view: the strongest wins. And that's exactly, by the way, what Scott Bessent said when it came to Greenland. He said exactly that. We are the strongest, so we decide. Period. You don't have the mean to defend Greenland against China, Russia. We can, therefore, we have the sovereignty over that, and we claim the sovereignty. So we are exactly in a very similar situation that we had with Venezuela. And here again, this is another crisis where Europe could have shown a different set of interests than the US. I mean, we understand that the US was claiming its own economic interest and all that, but EU could have claimed its values. I mean, EU is supporting Ukraine against Russia based on its so called values. But suddenly, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to Venezuela, EU forgets its values because these values of the EU is in fact subordinate its economic and political interest of keeping good relations with the US. And that's where we are. So we have here a significant crisis, not just within NATO, but also within the EU itself. And we see, and that's very interesting because you may remember that in 2022, the European Union and many experts in the West were saying that at the end of the Ukraine crisis, the European Union and NATO will emerge as reinforced by the crisis. And today we see that exactly the opposite, that the Russia China have get closer, have established closer relationships, that the BRICS dynamics, or the dynamics that goes with the BRICS has improved and reinforced, and therefore the rest of the world has in fact reinforced itself, while the West has definitely weakened itself. So it's a kind of a paradoxical situation that we are witnessing today, and I think one of the major crises we have had in NATO since my I understand, or I was in capacity of understanding geopolitics and all that. That means in the last 50 years or so, this is the major crisis I can see, and it's we don't see exactly how this will can be solved. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Bon, on va regarder là. C'est pas ça. Qu'est-ce qui se passe? Bof. Do you hear me?
Carl,
Yes.
I had some sort of issue here. Yeah, it seems. uh, Yeah, it seems that the internet connection is still the issue. And Carl, let me ask you something else that is related to what's going on in Greenland, which is the situation in Ukraine. We know that Europe has, transferred all the weapons, the majority of weapons they had, to Ukraine to fight Russia in Ukraine. And right now they're thinking that they may want to defend Greenland, which is, in my opinion, that's not going to happen. But is Europe going totally dependent on the United States? And what is the future for Europe in that case? It's not just on in the case of weapons, in the case of the energy, the oil. And if they go totally dependent on the United States, what is the future if the United States tomorrow decides to put sanctions on Europe? Who's going to provide them with energy?
Well, this is the problem and the lack of strategic vision of Europe. By cutting itself from the cheap Russian energy, Europe has increased its dependency on the United States. Europe is not dependent on Russia, or was not dependent on Russia. It is dependent on energy. Europe has no energy, basically, and relies on external suppliers. And in the early 70s, this dependency on the Middle East has been highlighted, and that's also the reason why the Europe increased its relationships with Soviet Union at that time. And it's important to remind people that since the late 60s, Soviet Union was supplying Europe with cheap oil and cheap gas. And even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union has never stopped its supplies of oil and gas of Europe, even if we were during the Cold War. As a matter of fact, the Soviets and now the Russians have always made a clear distinction between what is military strategic, if you want, and what is economic or trade related. And they never mixed the two. So they had contracts with the supply of energy to Europe, and they always kept this contract. They never denounced this contract. This is the Europeans, in fact, that especially after 2014, the Europeans started to play this relationship in energy in terms to not blackmail the Russians, but in order to make pressure, to put pressure on Russia for some reason. And that ended up in 2022 with the cutting of all energy. I mean, just take the example, which is less known, but it's still an example of the Baltic states, who used to be integrated in the same power grid as Russia. And therefore, these countries benefited from very cheap electricity coming from Russia. And in 2025, they decided to stop this relationship and to cut their supply from Russia and to turn on European energy. As a result, now they pay the electricity three times the price they paid to the Russians, even if the Russians never threatened. I mean, with that, I'm talking about 2025. And before that, the Russians have never threatened to use electricity or this supply of electricity for political purposes. But just on ideological ground, the Baltic state decided to cut the energy. And now the problem is that the energy is much too expensive. And that has led to some difficulties in the industry of the Baltic states. Exactly the same thing as we have seen in Germany, where some companies lose their competitiveness because of the high price of basic supply to produce items. So we have here in Europe, they systematically cut themselves from cheap energy, and with the idea of relying more on the US, with the idea that the US would always uh, be their ally. And politically, it might be that the US remain the ally of Europe. But on other aspects, such as economy and things like this, these are things that the US will seeks its own interest, not the interest of Europe. Europe is a competitor of the US. And here it's also interesting to see the comparison. US and Europe are competitors, while Europe and Russia were never competitors. In fact, they were complementary. Russia provided raw material, uh, uh, potash, and energy and things like this, while Europe provide finished products. So Europe and Russia were in fact complementary and not competitors as such. US, Europe, and China are competitors, but Russia was not. Now, Russia is on the way of being a competitor to, or it's a long way to go, but it is on its way to be a competitor to Europe on many products, especially um, farming products, wheat and grain and this kind of thing. I mean, remember that before the first sanctions on Russia, I mean, not the first one, but the sanctions on Russia in 2014, where the embargo on providing grain to Russia, Russia was a net importer of grain. And today, because of the sanction, Russia has become one of the major worldwide exporter of grain. So we see that from this complementary position between Russia and Europe, Russia is emerging as a competitor due to the sanction. Because, and remember what Sergei Lavrov said, it was, I think, that was probably in August last year or so, when he was interviewed on, I think it was CBS News, and the journalist asked him if the Russia was demanding the relief of the sanctions, and Sergei Lavrov said no. We are not demanding any relief in terms of sanctions, because for us the sanctions were an opportunity. Because of the sanctions, we could discard the some kind of a possible competition from Europe, let's say, and develop our own industry without without the European competition. Meaning that, in fact, the sanctions have acted as a protective or protectionist measure to develop some industries in Russia. And that's a reason why today Russia is not asking for having these sanctions removed. They are, in fact, imposed protectionist measures to the for Russian economy, and that's something that the Europeans have not understood. In any case, what's going on today, to answer your question, is that Europe has cut itself from any other supplier than the US. And today, the US is acting as a competitor with another competitor. And therefore, they say, well, we are in competition. We sell you energy like oil and liquefied natural gas. Fine. But for the rest, we are in competition, and therefore Europe find itself again between two in sitting between two chairs somehow. It is a lack of long-term vision in the European foreign policy, and I would say even in the general economic policy of the EU. There is no vision on that. We see that the Europeans have not been able to develop or to, let's say, to establish themselves as an actor on future technologies. For instance, they may have some local initiatives and project, because obviously in Europe you have a lot of smart people and educated people, and they can develop something. But EU never managed to develop the structures to develop further all these initiatives and all these I would say these the projects or the ideas that are emerging within Europe. They appear, and but there is no structure to take them and to make them evolving in something bigger. You see that when we talk about social networks or something like that, to talk about Amazon, talk about Google. This is the US. The Chinese have developed similar things. The Russians have started to develop also similar things. Europe has none. Europe has none. And that shows that despite the huge potential that does exist in Europe, because of the lack of vision of the European leaders, these all these capabilities that we have in Europe have not been developed into assets to challenge or to address future challenges. And that's exactly where we are. I mean, Greenland is only an illustration of this lack of vision, lack of understanding. Why are Americans interested in Greenland? It's not just because it's a huge island. It's also because you may find in Greenland a lot of rare material or rare earth or strategic materials and things like this that could be instrumental in developing future technologies. That's the reason why Donald Trump has decided that Greenland is a necessity for for U.S. security. It's not just a question of geography. I mean, they had already military bases in Greenland, and therefore this is not the military uh, aspect is not the key things here. Here, there are other aspects that are underground, if I can literally say, that are much more important to the US, because the US, from all the superpower that are emerging today, namely China, but also Russia, the US is the only superpower that lack the access to strategic material like rare earths and all that. I mean, it has some, but definitely not enough to be to challenge the technological development of China, or even in the near future Russia. Russia is not so far at this stage, but China is certainly, and this is the main, I would say, economic or technological threat to the US. And that's why the US understands that without access to those strategic material, it will never be able to compete with China. And remember what we have seen last year, as the US threatened China with the tariffs, or threatened China, or threatened China with supplying Taiwan with weapons and things like this. What did China do? They just cut the supply of rare earth, and we know that rare earth and other strategic material are key for the defense technology that the U.S. wants to develop. In other words, this move towards Greenland is an attempt to address this issue. That's why we may have, by the way, I mean, this idea that was floated by the Trump administration, that Canada might at one point become part of the United States. This is probably something that the Canadians should take seriously, even if it sounds strange as of today. But that's probably something, because the US considers that without direct access and without free access to those strategic resources, it will not be able to challenge the emerging power of China. And China is, in that sense, extremely rich in rare material, strategic material, and all that. In addition to that, China is now strongly tied to Russia, because both countries have understood that they are both the targets of both the Europeans and the Americans, and therefore now they are very strongly tied to each other. As a result, we have created, I mean, the Europeans and the West at large has created, I would say, a very strong bloc that is able to address future challenges, namely Russia and China, while themselves are much weaker in this area. And that's the reason why you have United States understanding that they need to take a hold on Southern America, because in South America you have a lot of countries with a lot of strategic material that are needed. By the way, the whole issue of Chile in the 70s was already driven by the issue of copper, which was produced by a Chilean, one of the major producer of copper, and in the 70s with the foreseen at that time development of computing and electronics and all that, copper has become an extremely valuable and even strategic asset at this time, and that's the reason why the Americans sponsored. I mean, sponsored is a polite word to say provoked the coup for the against the Salvador Allende, to gain control over these resources. And today we have a similar attempt with the South America, and that's the reason why the national security strategy put emphasis on the need for the US to have this control over the Western Hemisphere, as I said before. So we are back to this, and all this is related to the access of strategic resources in order to allow the possible competition between the US and China.
Carl, you see, do you see any sort of concern on the part of Europeans in what's going on in the West Asia? We know we were on the verge of a new war in the Middle East between Iran and the United States, and maybe, yeah, and of course, Israel would be part of that if that happens. And what is the official policy of Europe?
Well, this is very hard to understand which is the real policy of what the European want. I mean, obviously, in 2015, as the JCPOA was signed, obviously Europeans wanted to act as I would say as a buffer. I would say between the U.S. and Iran. In the antagonistic position between Iran and the U.S. is known since the late 70s, and it was clear that this whole issue of this nuclear development in Iran has been a pretext of that, and that's the reason why you had the Europeans who tried to get to be in between, to be in some way moderators in the whole issue. But as we have seen in the last 2 years, when you had those missile exchange between Iran and Israel, we have seen that Europe has lost all its credibility in that. The voice of Europe is not listened to in any way. By the way, after the GCPOA was signed, namely in 2017, I mean, it was signed in 2015, if I'm not wrong, and in 2018, just before Donald Trump withdrew from the treaty, it has been acknowledged both by the IEA and by the West powers that Iran complied with the treaty, and therefore, the as stated in the treaty, the sanctions should be removed from Iran, and that's the point where Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the treaty, and it could have been an opportunity for the Europeans to show their independence by saying, "Okay, now the U.S. has withdrawn from the treaty. We are now the signatories, all of us, Iran, European Union, France, UK, and so on, China also. So we decide that now we lift the sanctions." And in fact, they could have done that because if they had respected the treaty, but they didn't dare to do that. They didn't dare to do that because they were afraid of possible retaliation from the US. And at that point, I think the US understood that regardless of what they do, the Europeans will never take an independent stance on all those issues. And therefore, as of today, and that's exactly as I said before, we have seen in the last 2 years, Europe has no voice anymore. Nobody listened to them. They have lost every credibility in the Middle East because, in particular, because of the handling of the JCPOA, but not only, and also in the whole crisis in Israel. As I said very often, I said that about Ukraine. I mean, when you are involved in a conflict, if you are Iranian, Russian, Ukrainian, Palestinian, Israeli, and all of these people think they fight for the right cause. And that's okay. That's their vision, and they have a rationale to fight. But those who are outside of the conflict, I mean, geographically, but also somehow intellectually or politically, like Europe, could afford to have an independent position, a more objective position, a more neutral position between the actors in order to facilitate the dialogue, in order to facilitate some kind of reconciliation, in order to mediate in the conflict, to act as mediators in all these conflicts. But as you can see, Europe has failed to understand this possible role. Without accepting what US was doing, I mean, they accepted tacitly, but they never wanted to openly confront the US because they're afraid of the US. And and that's extremely strange because today we see that when it comes to these conflicts, the US remain the on the one hand the main promoter of war, but at the same time the main solution to the conflict. So we have here this kind of dual role of the US that we have seen in Palestine. I mean, they offer weapons to Israel, they support the Israeli, and all that, but at the same time, they are the only ones who try to solve the crisis. And of course, when they solve the crisis, they solve it in their way. That means they solve it in order to support their own interests. They're not supporting the interests of Palestine or maybe not even Israel. They are promoting their own interests, and that will be the same with Iran, and that will be the same with Ukraine. The fact is that Europe has never been able to find its place as an external power of these conflicts and therefore have a credible voice to solve the conflict. And that's exactly where the big mistake is in Europe. But we are back to what I said at the very beginning regarding the issue of Denmark, is that in Europe, for some reason, since a couple of years, the focus is on Russia and nothing else. When Kaya Kallas goes in China to talk about quite important matters, because China is obviously one of the major economic partner or economic competitor even of Europe. Well, what does she want to talk about? Is about Russia. So it's all about Russia. There is nothing else than Russia. The problem is that we see that there are other challenges that affect directly Europe without being even related to Russia. And because of this kind of blindness that you have in Europe, well, they have not been able to anticipate any other problem. They are not been able to anticipate any, for instance, we could have a situation with Iran where Europe has normal trade relationship with Iran, even if Iran has still an issue with the US. And this issue will probably not be solved very quickly, but you could have, in the meantime, you could have, based on the GCPOA as an example, you could develop some trade relationship, and that would help to the evolution of the situation. And that would be the same. We could have a very similar situation with Palestine, for instance, where even if the Europeans are not directly involved in the conflict, well, based on the issue of human rights, international law, and things like that, Europe could play a role in between the Palestinians and the US slash Israeli bloc there. But Europe has never courage to go along with those, with such a policy of the one who is in between. We are in between geographically. We are between the US and Russia. We are between, well, depending how you look at at the world, but Europe is in between the US and China, is in between the US and the Middle East. So there are a lot of, I mean, geographically, Europe has a lot of argument, but also politically, because Europe is closer to the Middle East than the US. Obviously, it's not just about oil; it's about other product and relationship, migration, cultural cooperation, and. So Europe could play a much bigger role if it had a broader vision of its future. The problem again is we are back to what I said just before. Europe is just focusing its future on the future of Russia. And this is something that a lot of people, even within the European Union itself, in the parliament, but somehow among European countries, people start to question seriously the intellectual ability of the European Union to address complex problem beyond the simple, I mean, the simple, it's not a simple problem, but beyond the problem of Russia. And that's where I think the Europe is failing by keeping its eyes focused on one aspect of things instead of having a broader understanding of its own future, of its own position in the world, of its own, let's say, opportunities in order to gain a role. Europe could have a major role in moderating the conflict between the U.S. and Russia, for instance, or U.S. and China, or U.S. and the Middle East, and Iran is a case in point. But they don't have the courage to do that. And even when I say they don't have the courage, we can even go further, because I said, for instance, that the Europeans were didn't lift the sanctions against Iran after it was said that Iran complied with the JCPOA. And of course, the Europeans were afraid of possible retaliations from the Americans. But it's interesting because the European legislation provide there is a special law that exists in the EU that protects European industries and companies from possible US retaliation in terms of sanctions and all that. But they never use that law because they're afraid of making the US angry. So we have the legal tools to to react to the US or to defend ourselves against it, but they are even afraid to use that because they're afraid of the reaction of the US. But they're also afraid of the reaction of the US because they cannot talk to the US. And when we talk about, again, Russia, 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 but when it came to a discussion with, and I remember as Kaya Kallas was elected, not elected, nominated in a position, and when the new Trump administration came in power, Kaya Kallas tried to go to visit Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. And when she landed in Washington, Rubio just declined or postponed the meeting. And Kaya Kallas had to go back to Europe without having seen Rubio. That means that the communication between Europe is and the US is extremely bad because the Europeans have again based all their policy on how the US should behave towards Russia. And again, this is this focus on Russia that is today affecting the whole credibility of the EU. And the Greenland is just the, the cherry on the cake, in fact, if you want.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems, Carl, I apologize to our audience because we have some sort of technical issues here. But Carl, thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always. And I apologize again for this sort of issues that we have here. And I hope we can solve them as soon as possible.
Yeah, no,
Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today.
no problem. Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you to all those who follow this program for their support. Thank you very much.
Yeah.